Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I want to talk to you about something that's dominating the headlines right now, the so-called breakthrough in Ukraine, with President Trump claiming that peace is just around the corner. Now, before we celebrate, before we pop the champagne, I want us to do what we always do, look beneath the surface. Because what's happening right now isn't just about peace. It's about power. It's about economics, and it's about who wins and who loses when the smoke finally clears. Let me start with a question that should be on everyone's mind. Why now? Why, after nearly 4 years of devastating warfare, are we suddenly hearing about peace deals and breakthroughs? Is it because the warring parties have suddenly discovered compassion? Is it because they've finally recognized the immense human suffering? Or is it because the economic and geopolitical calculations have changed? Here's what we know. The Trump administration has presented what they're calling a framework for peace, initially 28 points, now reportedly trimmed down to 19. And what's in this framework? According to multiple reports, Ukraine would be required to cede significant territory in the eastern Donbas region, recognize Crimea as Russian, cap the size of its military, and permanently forswear NATO membership. In exchange, Russia would agree to a ceasefire and some form of security guarantees. Now, the administration is claiming progress, saying there are just a few remaining points of disagreement. Ukrainian President Zelensky, who just days ago warned his country faced a choice between dignity and a key partner, now says Ukraine is ready to advance the peace framework. But let's be honest about what we're really looking at here. This isn't a peace deal negotiated between equals. This is what happens when one side, exhausted, outgunned, and abandoned by key allies, is forced to accept terms it would have rejected outright just months ago. Ukrainian officials are reportedly willing to discuss this framework, not because it's a good deal, but because they've been given little choice. The alternative: continue fighting with dwindling support and watch more territory slip away. Now, I want you to think about this from an economic perspective, because that's where the real story lies. Wars are extraordinarily expensive. The United States has poured over $100 billion into supporting Ukraine military aid, economic assistance, humanitarian support. European nations have contributed billions more. Russia, meanwhile, has been bleeding its economy dry, facing sanctions, losing access to Western markets, watching its young men die in trenches for territorial gains measured in kilometers. At some point, the cost-benefit analysis shifts. At some point, even the most committed warmongers start doing the math. And here's where it gets interesting. President Trump, who positions himself as a dealmaker, a businessman, sees this war the way a CEO sees a failing division of a company. It's hemorrhaging money, it's creating instability, and it's not producing the returns that justify the investment. His administration has made it clear. They want this war over, and they want it over on their timeline, regardless of whether that timeline serves Ukraine's interests. They've given Zelensky deadlines, they've applied pressure, and they've crafted a deal that, by most accounts, heavily favors Russian territorial demands. But let's zoom out even further, because this isn't just about Ukraine and Russia. This is about the entire post-Cold War order. For 3 decades, the United States has operated under the assumption that it could expand NATO eastward, that it could encircle Russia, that it could dictate terms to a defeated rival. Well, that assumption has been tested, and the test has revealed some uncomfortable truths. Russia was willing to go to war to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. Russia was willing to endure economic sanctions, international isolation, and massive casualties to achieve its objectives. And now, if this deal goes through, Russia will have secured, through force, what it couldn't secure through diplomacy. a guarantee that Ukraine will never be part of the Western military alliance. Now, here's where I want to challenge the narrative we're being fed. We're told this is about peace. We're told this is about ending the suffering. And yes, ending the war would stop the immediate bloodshed. That's undeniable. But what kind of peace is this? It's a peace that rewards aggression. It's a peace that tells smaller nations, if a more powerful neighbor wants your territory, and if your allies grow tired of supporting you, you'll have no choice but to surrender. It's a peace built not on principles of sovereignty or international law, but on the cold calculation of military and economic power. And let's talk about what comes next, because the deal itself is only the beginning. According to the reported framework, there are provisions for economic reconstruction, for Russia to rejoin the global economy, for financial opportunities for Ukraine to rebuild. But who's going to pay for this? Who's going to finance Ukraine's reconstruction after forcing them to give up their most industrialized regions? The European Union, the United States, private investors looking to profit from the rubble. We've seen this movie before, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in countless other places where war is followed by lucrative reconstruction contracts that enrich corporations while ordinary people continue to suffer. Here's what really concerns me. This entire episode, from the initial invasion to this potential peace deal, reveals the bankruptcy of our current economic and political system. We live in a world where military force can still redraw borders. We live in a world where economic leverage can compel sovereign nations to accept terms they find humiliating. We live in a world where the suffering of millions of ordinary people, Ukrainian farmers, Russian conscripts, families torn apart by war, is subordinated to the geopolitical chess games of great powers. And I want to address something that's been conspicuously absent from most of the mainstream coverage, the class dimension of this conflict. Who has borne the cost of this war? Not the oligarchs in Moscow, who have moved their assets offshore, not the defense contractors in the West, who have seen their stock prices soar, not the politicians in Washington or Brussels, who have used the war to justify increased military spending. No, the cost has been borne by working people, Ukrainian civilians living under bombardment, Russian soldiers dying in trenches, European workers facing higher energy costs, American taxpayers funding endless military aid. And who will benefit from the peace? The same people who have benefited from the war. Reconstruction contracts will go to well-connected corporations. Natural resources in the disputed territories will be exploited by whoever controls them. Arms manufacturers will shift their focus to the next conflict, the fundamental dynamics of our economic system, where profit and power trump human welfare, will remain unchanged. Now, I'm not saying the war should continue. I'm not advocating for endless conflict. What I'm saying is that we need to be clear-eyed about what this peace deal represents. It's not a triumph of diplomacy. It's not a vindication of international law. It's a reflection of raw power, military power, economic power, geopolitical power, and it's being dressed up in the language of pragmatism and realism. The Trump administration is selling this deal as a win-win. Ukraine gets peace, Russia gets security guarantees, Europe gets stability, and America gets to reduce its commitments. But that's not how power works. In any negotiation between unequals, the stronger party extracts concessions from the weaker. And in this case, Ukraine, weakened by years of war, abandoned by allies who have grown weary of the conflict, is being asked to accept terms that legitimize territorial conquest through force. So what should we take away from all of this? First, we need to recognize that wars don't end because of moral epiphanies. They end when the costs outweigh the benefits, when the powerful decide their interests are better served by peace than by continued conflict. Second, we need to understand that the terms of peace reflect the balance of power. not the balance of justice. And third, we need to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? A world where might make right, where economic and military power determine which nations survive and which are carved up. Or a world built on different principles of genuine international cooperation, of economic democracy, of shared prosperity. The tragedy of Ukraine isn't just the war itself, it's that the war was avoidable. For decades, scholars and diplomats warned that NATO expansion would provoke exactly this kind of response from Russia. For decades, we were told these concerns were outdated, that Russia was too weak to matter, that the post-Cold War era meant the West could do whatever it pleased. Well, here we are. Hundreds of thousands of dead, millions displaced, a generation traumatized, and a peace deal that will leave Ukraine diminished and Russia emboldened. And the greatest tragedy of all, nothing fundamental will change. The same economic system that produces these conflicts, a system based on competition for resources, for markets, for geopolitical advantage, will continue to operate. The same military, industrial complex that profits from war will continue to lobby for increased defense spending. The same media outlets that amplified the drums of war will now applaud the peacemakers, without ever asking the hard questions about how we got here. Let me conclude with this. Peace is always better than war. I don't dispute that. If this deal ends the immediate bloodshed, if it stops the bombs from falling, if it allows people to return to some semblance of normal life, then it will have achieved something valuable. But we cannot pretend this is a just peace. We cannot pretend this resolves the underlying contradictions that produced the war in the first place. And we cannot allow the narrative of Trump, the deal maker, to obscure the reality of what's happening, a smaller nation being forced to accept a deeply unfavorable settlement because the great powers have decided it's time to move on. The real question before us isn't whether this particular deal succeeds or fails. The real question is whether we're willing to confront the system that makes such deals necessary. Are we willing to challenge an economic order that produces conflict and inequality? Are we willing to imagine alternatives to endless competition between great powers? Are we willing to build institutions and structures that prioritize human welfare over profit and power? These are not easy questions, and they don't have simple answers. But they're the questions we must ask if we want to break this cycle. The cycle of war and uneasy peace, of imperial competition and humanitarian catastrophe, of endless sacrifice by ordinary people for the benefit of elites. Until we're willing to ask these questions, until we're willing to challenge the fundamental assumptions of our economic and political system, we'll keep seeing the same pattern repeat itself in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, wherever powerful interests collide and ordinary people pay the price. Thank you for your time, and I hope this has given you something to think about. Not just about this particular deal, but about the world we're living in and the world we want to create. Because ultimately, that's the choice we face, not between this peace plan or that one, but between accepting the world as it is or working to build something better. Thank you.